Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Leadership Clarity Podcast. Today, I'd like to explore a topic that sooner or later touches every leader and every professional. It's about when good intentions create unintended friction. Have you ever had the feeling that something has shifted, but you couldn't quite explain why? Your conversations with your manager become shorter. Meetings feel more transactional. Feedback becomes less frequent. Nothing dramatic has happened. There hasn't been a conflict, no difficult conversations, and yet something no longer feels quite right. For a long time, I believed that if you work hard, delivered results, and acted with integrity, trust would naturally follow. Those things absolutely matter, yes. But experience has taught me they are not enough. Because leadership isn't defined by capability alone. More often, more often than we realize, it's shaped by judgment, not judgment of other people, leadership judgment. The ability to understand a situation before reacting to it, to recognize what another person may be experiencing, and perhaps most importantly, to recognize our own contribution to the very friction we're trying to resolve. One of the biggest traps I've seen, both in myself and in others, is how quickly we search for explanation outside ourselves. The relationship changes, communication becomes different. We no longer feel included in the way we once did, and our minds immediately begin filling in the gaps. Maybe my manager no longer values me. Maybe they are insecure. Maybe they don't like strong people around. Sometimes those explanations are true, but not always. Over the years, I've learned to pause before reaching any conclusion and ask myself one simple question. What if the friction isn't where I think it is? I'd like you to keep that question in the back of your mind as we talk today, because by the end of this conversation, I hope you'll be asking yourself a far more useful question. Before I share the experience that had changed my own thinking, there's something worth understanding. Whenever a new leader joins an organization, we naturally focus on the visible changes. A new reporting line, different priorities, a different leadership style. But in my experience, the biggest changes are usually invisible. Every new leader inherits relationships, history, unspoken expectations, existing loyalties, past successes, past disappointments. At the same time, the organization is trying to understand the new leader, while the new leader is also trying to understand the organization. Trust is no longer inherited, it has to be built. That's why every leadership transition quietly reshapes the environment around your role. When I say that, I'm not talking about office politics. I'm talking about the invisible dynamics that influence trust, decision making, credibility, and ultimately how your contribution is interpreted. Your role may stay exactly the same. The environment around it really does. Recognizing that shift is awareness. Responding to it wisely is leadership. And I didn't always understand that. In fact, one experience early in my career completely changed the way I think about leadership. By my late 30s, I had built a successful career in the oil and gas industry. I was leading complex commercial work, negotiating with major customers, and managing projects with significant business impact. I knew my business. I was confident in my expertise. And I genuinely enjoyed solving complex problems. Like many ambitious professionals, I believe that the more value I added, the better. Then I began to notice a subtle change. One of my managers gradually became more distant. There was no conflict, no difficult conversation, nothing I could point to say that's what changed. But our relationship no longer felt the same. At first, I did what many of us naturally do. I looked for explanations, for external explanations. Maybe our personalities were simply different, or maybe he preferred another communication style, or maybe he preferred engaging more with males rather than females. Then one day, I stopped asking what's happening to me, and instead, I asked a different question. I asked, what might I be contributing to this dynamic without even realizing it? Looking back, I think that's one of the most powerful questions any leader can ask. Not because we're always the cause, no, but because it's the one variable we have the power to change. So I stepped back and I started observing our interactions more objectively. And that's when something really clicked. I realized that whenever someone asked my manager a commercial or technical question, and when he paused to think, I would answer almost instinctively, not to impress anyone, not to prove I knew more, but because I genuinely believed I was helping. I wanted the customer to receive the best answer. And yes, I wanted the discussion to move forward. And yes, I wanted us to succeed. My intention was all good. But leadership is never judged by our intentions alone, it's judged by our impact. And what became painfully clear was the moment when I deliberately looked at the situation through my manager's eyes. And suddenly, I saw what I had completely missed. Every time I stepped in, I wasn't just contributing my expertise. From his perspective, I was stepping into his leadership space. Without meaning to, I was making it harder for him to lead. And that realization, s- it stayed with me ever since. Not because it challenged my confidence, no, but because it challenged one of my assumptions. For years, I believed that adding value meant contributing whenever I could. Now, I began asking myself a different question. Just because I can contribute, does it mean I should? That question changed the way I lead. Because there is a profound difference between adding value and creating value. Sometimes, yes, they're exactly the same, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes the greatest value you create comes from speaking, and sometimes it comes from creating the space for someone else to lead. Recognizing the difference is where leadership judgment begins. And that insight didn't just change one relationship, it changed the way I thought about leadership itself. Over time, I realized the biggest lesson wasn't about speaking less, it was about understanding my role differently. I then consciously assumed that every opportunity to contribute was an opportunity I should take. It wasn't. My responsibility wasn't to contribute every time I had the answer. It was to contribute where I could create the greatest value. Those aren't always the same thing. Sometimes the best contribution happens in the meeting. Sometimes it happens before the meeting, helping your leader think through a difficult issue. And sometimes it happens afterwards, helping turn decisions into actions. The destination doesn't change, the path does. And as soon as I became more intentional about that, something else changed. My relationship with the boss became stronger. There was more openness, more trust. Before important meetings, my manager would often ask for my perspective in advance. We would work through difficult issues together before either of us walked into the room. Nothing about my capability had changed. What changed was how we worked together. That experience taught me a lesson. I'd been looking at the relationship almost entirely through my own lens for quite some time. Once I stepped outside it, I started noticing something I completely missed. There isn't one right way to lead. Throughout my career, I worked with leaders who welcomed robust debate in the room. Others preferred to challenge ideas privately before a meeting. Some gave enormous freedom, others stayed closely involved. Neither approach is automatically better. Every leadership style brings strengths, and every leadership style, trust me, has blind spots. The question then isn't, why doesn't my leader work the way I do? A far more useful question is, what might I be missing that's important to my leader and ultimately to the business? That single question changed my perspective. Instead of defending my own approach, I became curious about theirs. And curiosity is a far better starting point than assumption. Today, whenever I sense friction beginning to develop, I resist the temptation to explain it too quickly. Instead, I pause, I step back, and I ask myself a few uncomfortable questions, such as, what might I be missing? Or what pressures could the other person be carrying that I can't yet see? And finally, is the impact I am creating the impact I intend? I found those questions don't make me weaker. No, they make my judgment stronger. Sometimes they show me that I need to change. Yeah. Sometimes they deepen my understanding of the other person. And sometimes they confirm that the environment itself is no longer healthy. Leadership judgment isn't about assuming you're always wrong, nor is it about assuming you're always right. It's about having the wisdom to know the difference. People sometimes ask me what managing upwards really means. To me, it has never been about managing your boss. It's about becoming more intentional in one of the most important professional relationships you'll ever have. Not by making yourself smaller, not by holding back your expertise, no, but by understanding when, where, and how your expertise creates the greatest value. Because we usually know our intentions. However, we are not always aware of our impact. And the space between the two is exactly where leadership judgment matters most. So the next time something doesn't feel quite right, before you ask, why doesn't my manager hear my point? Or why am I no longer included in certain conversations? Please pause and ask yourself a different question. A more useful one would sound like this: is the impact I'm creating the impact I intend? That question isn't about self blame, it's about self awareness. It's not about diminishing yourself, it's about becoming more intentional in how you lead, you influence, and build trust. Over the years, I've come to believe that capability will always matter, integrity will always matter, but neither on its own is enough to build lasting trust. Trust grows when people feel heard, when they feel respected, when they feel you create the conditions for them and for you to succeed. To me, that's what leadership judgment looks like in practice. So I'd like to leave you with one final thought. The quality of our leadership is often determined by the quality of the questions we are willing to ask ourselves, not when things are going well, but especially when they aren't. Because better questions lead to better judgment. Better judgment builds stronger relationships. And stronger relationships build trust. Thank you for spending time with me today. And if this conversation prompted you to reflect on even one relationship, one conversation, or one habit, then it's been worth it. Until next time, keep leading with intention and keep asking yourself, is the impact I am creating the impact I intend?